This is a good moment, I think, to open this to the floor. If you have a question, please raise a hand, and there's a gentleman there who's quick off the mark.
I couldn't resist asking this question because I'm a Harvard Business School class of '95, and it's our 20th reunion this year. And what's interesting is in a class of, a section of 80 people, about 12 of us went off to be entrepreneurs. And of those, I'd say half a dozen created great companies. The latest, I think, was the dialysis company that got sold for $1 billion. So the entrepreneur, I think, is still alive and well at Harvard. And the question I have for you is, what would you have done if PayPal had failed?
I think there's a problem in Western Europe where failure is it's too impossible to fail. Once you fail, you can never start over. I think there's an opposite version of this in California where I think sometimes people are a little bit too facile about failure because I think it actually is always incredibly damaging to people. And if you work really hard at something and it doesn't work, that's going to be psychologically damaging. People have less confidence. There are all sorts of reasons why that tends to be quite bad. I think that when people, I don't think there's that much you learn from failure, by the way, because it's typically overdetermined. It's like, why is technology slowing down? Why did you fail? It's typically 5 separate reasons. You worked with the wrong people. The idea was bad. The timing was wrong. It wasn't a monopoly. The product didn't work. And okay, next time I'm working with different people. You figure out 1 out of the 5 things, you're likely to fail again. So I think failure is not something one can learn very much from. So I think that's sort of a myth that I would challenge. But what I think you should do when something goes badly wrong is you just keep going. You do something else, and you don't dwell on the past.
One of the amazing things about teaching at Harvard Business School, which I did for a number of years, was that it has, I think, about the highest teaching standards of any institution I've ever worked in. I got significantly better as a teacher working there. But then one day it suddenly dawned on me that while I was teaching quite well, it wasn't entirely clear that the students were learning terribly aggressively. And I don't know whether your experience was skim the case and hope you're not cold, but it wouldn't have been unique if it had been. Right. QED. Okay, let's take another question. There's a gentleman there with a blue shirt and no tie, right in the middle. Just wait for the microphone, sir. Yeah.
You've used restaurants today and in your book as an example of businesses that don't create a lot of value. But there's a lot of jobs in these small businesses. Do you see technology creating new opportunities or changing the conditions of competition for small businesses like that operate in more competitive spaces?
There are large sectors of the economy in which that involves a lot of employment or creates a lot of value for consumers. These are not the sectors that you necessarily want to be involved in, I think, as an entrepreneur or as an investor, because my claim is always the equity part of the values is not that big. I think technology certainly can change the way things are done. There are, I would say, a lot of the service sectors have to my liking, seen too little technological change. So restaurants are not that different from what they were 50 or 60 years ago. And this is perhaps one of the reasons that technological progress has not been as fast, because manufacturing has kept improving at a very fast clip. But as a result, a larger and larger fraction of our GDP is in these service sectors where there's actually been less innovation, and we're not. Kindergarten teachers are not that much more efficient. Chefs aren't that much more efficient. Waiters aren't that much more efficient than they were 40 or 50 years ago. And the challenge would be to figure out ways to do that. To the extent you can, I think that's a problem sort of on a very different level from starting a restaurant per se. So it's again, there's probably are all sorts of interesting software and maybe some sort of manufacturing business that can be done. But that's sort of a very different problem from starting a restaurant itself.
Peter, just to follow up on that, does that conjure up a vision of a future in which a few people who are smart enough to own equity in monopoly-style businesses get as rich as you, and everybody else ends up working in the low productivity sectors where there will continue to be jobs because you can't really have technological progress in a restaurant. It's just cooking and serving people, and people do that.
Well, I think it depends a lot on how much innovation we have. You know, if we have a world like the last 40 years where you have a narrow cone of progress around IT, most other areas don't involve that much innovation, then most people end up stuck in these industries that end up becoming sort of competitive and often fairly marginal. But I don't think there's any reason that innovation cannot happen in many different fields simultaneously. I don't think there's any reason that you can't have more inventions, more monopoly-like businesses, or anything like that. The reality is we don't have that many of them. But my advice in my book 0 to 1 is, I had this interview a few months ago where it was like, wouldn't this be really discouraging to all these people who want to start businesses where the business isn't a monopoly? And my answer is always, I don't believe that there's anything intrinsically good about starting businesses per se. I want to encourage people to start more good businesses and fewer bad ones.
Let me turn back to the audience. There's a lady there, yes.
How do we, as individuals, make sure we're on top of technology and that we keep ourselves innovative? What tips do you have? Is it education, going to classes? Is it coming to things like this, being in touch with what people are doing in terms of setting up new businesses? What is it?
I'm always hesitant to say there's sort of like some generic answer for everybody. If I could give you an answer for something that everybody should do, then that would be, again, like telling everyone to open a restaurant or everyone to do the same thing. And then by definition, the value in that probably ends up being somewhat reduced.
But how do you do? I mean, how do you keep up to speed? Is it just a matter of they come to you, so you can't replicate?
I don't think you want to try to keep up to speed on absolutely everything that's going on in every aspect of the world. I think it ends up being somewhat serendipitous, somewhat idiosyncratic. It's things that you're really interested in, things that you're good at, things that not too many other people are doing. That's the three-part formula for what I think it would be good to focus on. Things you're good at, things you like doing, things not a lot of other people are doing. A lot of lawyers are good at it but don't like it. A lot of writers like it but aren't very good at it. So getting even 2 out of 2 is hard.
I'm kind of relieved that you picked on restaurants rather than people who write books for your example of a really very, very over-competitive field that you should not go into. Let's take another question. The gentleman who was sitting behind the lady who asked the question. Yes, sir.
I think when you invested in Facebook, the company was valued at 5 million, and that was after 7 months of it starting up. A few weeks ago, Meerkat, which had been around for about 3 weeks, was valued at 12 million. Do you think that we are overvaluing these tech startups?
It's certainly on an absolute scale, the valuations have probably been drifting up steadily over the last 10, 12 years. I certainly think, with the benefit of hindsight, in 2004, 2005, Facebook was very badly undervalued. People probably still had very serious hangover from the late 90s bubble, and then that hangover has sort of gradually been wearing off. And this is sort of a question that gets asked a lot, and it's never that easy to answer. Is are we in a second technology bubble? Is it like the 90s? Is it like the 90s all over again? I'm inclined to say that things are not as extreme as 99, 2000, which probably is not saying that much because things really were very crazy. The simplest argument for why I think we're not in a second technology bubble today is that I think all these bubbles, whether it's the tech bubble of the 90s, the housing bubble of the 2000s, the education bubble today, maybe the bond bubble in government bonds, I think all these bubbles are psychosocial phenomena which only become really dangerous when the public as a whole gets involved. And on the second technological wave in Silicon Valley in the last decade or so, the public has broadly not been involved. There were 300 technology IPOs in the US in 1999. There were something like 37 in 2014. They're happening sort of at a much, much later stage, at a point where the companies are much more mature. And for all these reasons, I think it's probably not insanely overvalued as a category, but certainly the actual valuations are way higher for a company at the exact same stage as they were in 04, 05. Although I think we can safely say things were really undervalued a decade ago. Whether they're somewhat or very overvalued is a little bit harder to say today.
You carefully dodged the question about the company Meerkat itself, and I don't blame you for that. But the question that the audience will not forgive me for not asking is, well, are there some companies out there that we haven't heard of that we should be very excited about and following closely? I mean, I know what you're going to say. It's my duty to ask this question.
Well, if I could tell you the answer, that would be sort of counterproductive. So it's, yes, there always are. It's always like what's true that nobody agrees with you on. The entrepreneur version is what great business is nobody starting. The investor version is always what great company are people missing. And so it's always the combination of a really good company and one that people are not talking about. And I'm probably always a little bit heavily biased towards the second half of that, of trying to understand why is there a systematic blind spot that people are not talking about a business in one way or another. And there are the certain categories where I think people are too focused on, the others people are missing. In general, if you have large numbers of different investors, I can give a whole bunch of metrics, let's give a few. So if you have lots of different investors in a company, they will tend to talk about it a lot, and that will lead it to being overhyped. If you have sort of a single investor in a company, people often talk about it a lot less. And so one very simple screen would be the number of investors. The more investors you have, the more likely it is to be overhyped. There are all sorts of consumer companies where the product is one that investors would use. There are ones where it's a product investors would not use. I think I would be long Airbnb and short Uber as a relative value play because investors like being driven around in black town cars. Investors do not like sleeping on people's couches. And so there's sort of a way.
There's your tip.
You have sort of systematic
I got
blind
a tip
spots
out of him.
like this.
You know what to do in the morning.
There are, at Y Combinator in Silicon Valley, every startup is told you have 3 months to generate a graph. And it's like an x-axis. X-axis is time, 0 to 3 months. Y-axis is any metric you can come up with. And it's supposed to be an exponential graph. And it's this thing that sort of by osmosis transfers the mania of the users into investors bidding up your valuation. And the reason we live in a world that's dominated by exponential graphs is because we live in this sort of generally quite nihilistic world in which people have no opinions or convictions of their own. And so they're very easily influenced by exponential graphs. And that's all, and that's why that's the key thing to generate is an exponential graph. The kinds of things that are, I would say, systematically undervalued are technology companies that have, let's say, more of a 0 to 1 or binary aspect. So if the pitch is, I need to raise $5 million to build this particular machine or to create this drug, and it will only work once all the pieces come together in the right way. That is a category that I think is systematically underfunded, very hard to pull off in our world because we live in this generally nihilistic world where the coordination problems you have in convincing people of something that does not exist, that doesn't have the feeling it's already partially existing, ends up being extraordinarily hard. One of the sort of investments we got the most pushback on at Founders Fund over the years was investing in SpaceX, which we did in 2008. It was 6 years into the company's history. Elon had already personally put $100 million into the company.
This is Elon Musk.
Yeah, he had already personally put $100 million in. And the first 2 rockets had failed, but it looked like they were pretty close to getting it to work. I mean, if you actually looked at all the economics on it, they were all like pretty good. It was sort of it wasn't that cash intensive because the rockets were paid for in advance. So it was sort of a generally cash flow positive business. They had 10 more rocket launches by contract they'd signed up for. They're probably going to get it the 3rd or 4th time around. And this was the sort of thing people just thought, you were really, really crazy to invest in something like that. So I think non-graph investments tend to be, are systematically not being done, therefore probably systematically undervalued.
Peter, you've given us an example of a kind of exponential chart in conversation this evening. It's been a huge pleasure to listen to you think on your feet or on your seat as you always so brilliantly do. I'm now in a position, judging by that ticking clock up there, to wrap this up. I've got to do it in a somewhat complex way because I not only want the audience to hold your applause, I want you not only to thank Peter, but I also want you simultaneously and therefore with great élan to thank Alan and Sabine Howard for the idea of this discussion series and for making it happen. So please join me, ladies and gentlemen, in a big thank you.